Losing the Plot is a series all about video game narrative, and as you'd expect, it's full of spoilers for all of these games and films. And because we're talking about horror, this might feature scenes of violence and gore, and touch on some sensitive topics. You have been warned. Halloween is upon us, which means all manner of frights await us in the dark, waiting to pounce. There's no escaping the horrors hiding in the shadows, as the ghosts and zombies and otherworldly terrors cannot be stopped. It's enough to drive someone mad. I guess there's no option but to face the horrors head on by playing some spooky games. And there are a lot to choose from, with the horror genre brimming with games from indie passion projects to AAA blockbusters. But why is horror in games so popular? And what do games do to tell a scary story? Well, that's what today's episode is all about. For this video, I've picked out 5 games to focus on, all of them classics of the genre that have shaped it into what it is today. Resident Evil, Silent Hill 2, Fatal Frame 2, Dead Space, and Amnesia: The Dark Descent are the focus of today's episode of Losing the Plot, as I take them to my lab, perform some experiments, and use them to work out the formula for a good video game horror story. But why these games? Well, Resident Evil coined the term survival horror and popularised the genre in a huge way, to the point where 1999 on the PS1 was an avalanche of titles using the same formula. Silent Hill 2 is a masterpiece of horror storytelling that arguably hasn't been matched since its release in 2001. Dead Space is a popular action-oriented horror title that takes a different, although still valid, approach to its spooks. Amnesia popularised the stalker genre of horror at a time where the games industry insisted that no one cared about horror anymore, and now look at us, we can't move for similar titles. And finally, Fatal Frame 2 is my favourite horror game of all time. Look, it's my video, I can do what I want. But to be fair, it does bring a uniquely Japanese feel and unique mechanics, so it is acceptable. And while these 5 games will be the focus today, I will of course be referencing other titles and movies throughout this to a lesser degree. But before we look at how games tell horror stories, we need to understand what a horror story is and why we tell them. Pinning down when horror stories began is a difficult one. They are quite literally tales as old as time. Horror movies were flying the flag long before games got in the action, and even they're older than you think. Before the slashers of the 80s, the Hammer horror movies of the 1950s, the Universal monster movies of the 1930s, even before Nosferatu in 1922, it's generally accepted that Georges Méliès's 1896 short Le Manoir du Diable is the first known horror film. And yeah, I probably butchered that pronunciation. But even before that, horror literature has been popular since, oh god, who knows. I searched around for the earliest horror novel and nobody could seem to agree on what it actually was. Some sources said the Gothic literature of the 1700s kicked off the genre, with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto often credited as the originator of the term horror as a genre. But even before that, Shakespeare wrote ghosts into his plays. Books about witches in the 1400s enraptured Europe to such a degree that an alarming number of real-life women were killed under suspicion of witchcraft. The Divine Comedy presented horrific imagery to craft a vision of hell that became influential on our cultural beliefs for centuries. But even going further back, mythology and fairy tales have their fair share of horror. Monsters and demons are everywhere in folklore, with many of the modern cultural touchstones emerging from tribes telling tales of creatures out in the dark woods or out in the vast ocean. As long as humans have been telling each other stories, we've been scaring each other. Horror has historically been a way for us to make sense of things we don't understand, a way to teach children fables about how to stay safe from the dangers that surround us. And what's more, we just like spooking each other. Psychologists are still divided on what it is about horror that appeals to us so much, with theories ranging from catharsis, thrill-seeking, morbid curiosity, and just a way for us to process our own fears in a safe environment. But what makes an effective horror story? Let's look at various ways of generating horror in stories, and how our game selections employ those techniques. Have you ever woken up at night feeling thirsty? So you get out of bed and head towards the stairs, but when you turn on the landing light, the bulb goes out. You stand at the top of the stairs, staring down into an inky blackness. You need water, and now you need a new bulb. Both of those things require you to descend into that darkness. And suddenly, you find yourself fearful. The quiet of the night and the limited visibility allow the mind to play tricks on you, imagining what could be hiding in wait. This is the concept of nothing is scarier. We fear the unknown, and as creatures that navigate primarily through sight or through sound, the absence of light and noise presents a risk. That risk could be anywhere from bumping into a cabinet because it's too dark to see in front of yourself, all the way up to, being eaten by a grue. This is all over horror. This is the empty corridor at night, the thicket of trees with no visible sightline, the well at the bottom of the garden, or the noises coming from the back room despite you being alone in the house. You should probably check that, by the way. Movies employ this with characters alone in the house, or in the woods, or just generally stuck somewhere alone. Or are they? Resident Evil and Fatal Frame conceal the dangers ahead using camera angles, while the fog of Silent Hill also keeps things out of the player's view. Being able to hear zombies but not see them as you move through the winding corridors of the Spencer mansion enhances the trepidation as you step from screen to screen. The dim light of the apartment complex in Silent Hill 2 hides the horrors that await, while the Minakami village streets are shrouded in moody darkness, and long forest paths add concealing tree cover. Dead Space uses the vacuum of space to achieve a similar effect. Certain moments of the game require you to head out of an airlock, at which point the sound design shifts, allowing you to hear Isaac's laboured breathing and grunts in his helmet more clearly, but the world around him is completely silent. How does each game employ this as part of its narrative, though? If I was to place them on a scale, I'd start with Resident Evil at the bottom. The original game's B-movie charm doesn't allow for many quiet moments, so the most notable example of this being used effectively comes not from the original game, but from its remake. Early on in the first Resident Evil, there is a corridor where zombie dogs come bursting through the windows. It's a shocking moment, but it's a cheap jump scare. In the remake on the GameCube, however, the dogs don't show up until the second time you venture through here, putting veteran players on edge as they brace themselves for a shock that doesn't come. But newer players might miss the significance of this, which is why I feel the sequel's equivalent handles this much better. I've talked about this in my video on why the Resident Evil 2 remake is rad, but let's talk about the Licker's first appearance from the original becoming a scene with a gruesome body, lots of blood and some ominous claw marks, all suggesting the presence of a terrible creature that never shows. While veterans were bracing themselves and getting all tense for a moment that subverts their expectations, new players see all the clues laid out and proceed with extra caution into the next corridor, not sure what to expect. The Licker's absence is more terrifying here than its presence in the original. However, narratively, Resident Evil as a series is less about tension and more about crazy revelations and gore, so there aren't many other examples that work as effectively as this one. Dead Space opens with a huge dose of nothing is scarier as Isaac and crew arrive on an empty ship and the eerie quiet sets the tone. You're not alone in this sequence, but the threat is still imminent. This tension doesn't last as the game then moves into Resident Evil style action for the rest of its runtime, although moments like lights going out for no reason show more of an effort to move in this direction here and there just to keep you on your toes. Fatal Frame 2 is better at this. Like Dead Space, the arrival of twin sisters Mio and Mayo to the village is tense and quiet, with no sign of other people anywhere. But while Dead Space ended this tension with creatures bursting out of vents in a chase sequence, Fatal Frame prolongs this. It takes a full chapter for a ghost to attack, and the earliest sign that something is present is a quiet, understated moment designed to cause a chill rather than a jump. During a conversation between the two sisters, Mio feels a hand on her shoulder, and she touches it affectionately, only to witness her sister walk right past her. We never find out who or what the hand belonged to as we explore the first house, but it definitely wasn't Mayu, and that creates a real sense of dread. Silent Hill 2 trades a lot more on moments of quiet emptiness. Aside from the persistent fog, a mood setter if ever there was one, there are lots of little moments that show the game's commitment to keeping you guessing and keeping you tense. James crossing the lake in a boat is both a poignant narrative moment and one filled with dread as you wonder when something is going to pop out and capsize the boat. James having to reach into holes to retrieve items, leading you to wonder just what's inside there. Even the introduction of Pyramid Head, where he just stands there menacingly, is so much more terrifying than if he came out swinging his big knife from the get-go. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a game that trades almost exclusively in the idea that nothing is scarier. The game's narrative is shrouded in more mystery than the others, as it's the only one where we don't understand the protagonist's motivations from the get-go. The STARS team were chased by zombie dogs while searching for their colleagues. James Sunderland is grieving for his wife and returning to a special place in his memory. The Amakura sisters got lost in the woods and found themselves trapped. And Isaac Clarke was a professional space engineer trying to find his missing girlfriend. But Daniel? As the title of the game suggests, he has amnesia. All we know is he's woken up in a creepy castle, and the only clue to whatever is going on is a note from himself, warning him not to regain his memories. What did he see or do to result in severe, self-inflicted memory loss? Why is he even here? And why is it so dark around here? In the early parts of Amnesia, you face no danger whatsoever, but it never feels like that. Every area is designed to maximize the feeling of dread, from sound design to darkness to occasionally seeing something, and then nothing happens. All of this, combined with not really knowing what's going on, is a big part of why I couldn't play it to the end. So clearly it was doing something right. But of course, all that tension needs a payoff. After building up the anxiety for a while, throwing a big old jump scare into the mix to throw everyone off is pretty common. If that jump scare serves to make the tension worse going forward, even better. The problem with this is that it can be done badly. Very, very easily. Have you ever watched a bad horror movie that just makes you jump for no reason? Or perhaps you've played a game that arbitrarily throws things off walls for no reason, as if to say, "Are you scared yet?" It's not elegant. It's not clever. Stop it. I'm talking about you, Amy. Yeah, I did a video on you. You know what I'm talking about. But it can be done right. It just has to be earned, and it can't be just for the sake of it. So let's see how our games hold up on this front. Resident Evil is probably the cheapest for this, without a doubt. The aforementioned dog scene stands out, but due to the game's general lack of real tension, every time a creature shows up it tends to be less shocking and surprising and more, what do I have to fight off now? In fact, the most notable jump scares I can think of are usually hunters jumping out of nowhere to instantly rip your head off in what is the game's cheapest attack. It doesn't do much for tension or fear, and instead makes me annoyed that I've been arbitrarily sent back to a save room. Not cool, Capcom. Amnesia fares a little bit better, but it's really bad for exploiting cheap scares. A door bursts open early on out of nowhere, and the game is actively programmed to spawn monsters in certain places for certain actions. For instance, a scene where you unlock a door and immediately a creature is behind you giving chase. I don't like this because it's not interesting from either a narrative or a gameplay perspective. It does nothing to serve the narrative other than, ooh, something's out to get you, which the game's atmosphere does a more effective job of conveying on its own. And gameplay-wise, it's completely out of the player's control. While the game does use limited control to enhance its atmosphere, in this case it feels like a cop-out. I'd prefer the creature to be stalking around and there being a risk of being spotted, rather than the instant aha moment that happens here. Dead Space is also victim to a larger number of cheap jump scares, not least because the villainous necromorphs have a tendency to burst unexpectedly out of vents, but it manages to use them in really effective ways. A scene early on where the lights suddenly go out feels like a jump scare, but when nothing shows up it leads the player to feel tense and uncomfortable. And that's where the real effectiveness of that jump scare lies. There are also scenes where the shocking stuff is happening off in relative safety and helps to aid tension. In the opening sequence we see necromorphs burst from the ceiling and attack our crewmates, which we are helpless to stop. But we're still relatively safe, right up until one bursts out on our side too, prompting a chase. Another moment later introduces us to a new creature that murders a survivor behind the glass ahead of us, and while we're safe now, We also know we need to head through the door into the room we can now see the creature in. I really like how Dead Space handles this stuff, honestly. It ties its shocks to the necromorph's tendency to crawl through vents, creating a sense of paranoia for much of the game, rather than just making the player jump for the sake of it. And now we get to the good stuff. Silent Hill 2 rarely uses jump scares, relying mostly on atmosphere, eeriness, and gruesome visuals to unsettle, along with various plot points. It does engage in the old cheap jump scare like, oh hey, thanks for shuffling out from under that car out of nowhere. But most of the time when it uses them, they're used to create further tension. The knifing of Maria in the elevator is one such example, which is a shock because it happens to a character we've bonded with, and the sequence up to this point has been building up to it. These shocking moments are rare, they're earned, and they only serve to improve the game. Also, it should be noted that its predecessor has something to say about the cat scare cliché. In Silent Hill 1, a cat bursts out of a locker in the school, only to be eaten by an off-screen creature, which is the real scare. The same rattling locker is faced in the warped version of the school, and this time there's nothing there, which is much worse. Well played, classic Silent Hill, but the king of utilising shock and jump scares is Fatal Frame 2. It makes full use of its enemies being ghosts, as they will materialise wherever they damn well please. The reveals are also handled differently to traditional jump scares a lot of the time. Instead of a massive scare cord, often the ghosts will just be there. At best, you'll get some ghostly speech, like this from the first encounter.
Why?
When the game decides it does want to use scare cords, it's for big narrative moments. Flashbacks to deadly rituals, Mayu slowly losing her sanity in a room that may have once been the site of a massacre, that sort of thing. Fatal Frame 2 loves throwing shocking imagery at you, but it always serves to move events forward or enhances the atmosphere. It's a big part of why it's my favourite horror game. One thing we tend to not be collectively fond of is injuries and blood, which is why they're often employed in horror media. Gruesome deaths, mutilated corpses, gore, the list is endless. This is another horror trope that's tricky to do right. The Thing is a perfect example of where it's handled expertly. The audaciousness of the gore and the twisted practical effects only heighten the level of threat that the alien menace poses. And the fact that it all happens so shockingly serves to amplify the paranoia at the heart of that movie. God, I love The Thing. But if you're not John Carpenter in the 80s, it might not be so easy. And plenty of examples exist in horror media of gore for gore's sake, that adds nothing, says nothing, and ultimately leads to nothing but a load of corn syrup and red food dye on the floor. There are certainly games that use gore to an absurd degree, and in some cases their use of it undermines their central message more than it helps. But thankfully all 5 of our examples use it relatively well. Not that Amnesia uses a lot of it, there's certainly some body horror, especially if you catch glimpses of the monsters that give chase if they see you. The most common of these, the Grunt, is notable for its twisted head shape and abnormally elongated jaw. It appears to be the result of some kind of Frankenstein experiment, stitched together haphazardly from bits of skin. It's horrific to look at and you will instinctively run away from it. And then there's Agrippa, who is actually an ally, who has had his soul sealed in a decrepit old husk of a body, which is emaciated and features similar jaw problems to the Grunt. From all evidence, this is a man who should be dead, but isn't, and this grotesque image adds to the tense atmosphere and makes us wonder just how much we should trust him. What Resident Evil lacks in tense atmosphere, it makes up for in gruesome creature designs. It's the whole point of the franchise, to the point where the most recent games are built on an engine designed to make things look as gruesome as possible. Look at this shot from the RE2 remake, or literally anything from RE7 for proof. And it certainly makes sense for a zombie franchise. The game's earliest indicator that something is very wrong comes from a pool of blood.
Hope this is not Chris's blood.
And from this guy, who was pretty gruesome by 1996 standards, if not so much today. But on the whole, the first Resident Evil didn't initially lean into the body horror too much. This would be built on in later entries, as Umbrella's experiments got even more insane. Birkin in the immediate sequel is a textbook example, and of course, as stated, anything made with the Eerie engine was designed this way. But nowadays, the first game looks kind of tame. Anything involving biological horror here is more implied, with zombie viruses and biological experiments being referenced, but the dramatic transformations had to wait a little bit longer due to tech reasons. If I was using RE2 Remake though, this would be higher ranked. That game is in your face in all the right ways, and I love it. In Fatal Frame 2, the horrors you encounter are ghostly apparitions, so you're not really encountering twisted biological creatures or blood-drenched zombies. The protagonists don't even get gored in death scenes, they're just more drained of their life essence by spooks. And yet, Fatal Frame does still use gore, blood, body horror, and injury to great effect. The ghosts you face have died violent deaths, turning them into vengeful onryo of Japanese folklore. Their spirits still reflect the manner in which they died, most notably the broken neck woman and the falling woman who died from hanging and falling down a stairwell respectively. Seeing a woman with her head at a 90-degree angle or a woman whose limbs are not where they should be is not a pleasant sight. Elsewhere, the limbo man and woman bear gashes and cuts across their bodies. The man and woman in dark appear emaciated, and the mourners have their eyes gouged out. The dark implications of their deaths are the horror here, and it's continually shocking. The rituals described throughout the Fatal Frame series also lean into this, with the first game featuring a ritual that pulls each of a shrine maiden's limbs in different directions, or the third game describing a woman being painfully tattooed repeatedly, even in places where someone shouldn't be tattooed. The second game seems tame in comparison, with strangulation as its main theme, although its real horror is something we'll discuss later. Silent Hill 2's use of gore and body horror is designed to reflect the twisted psyches of those who inhabit the town. Much of the physical horror here comes from the creature designs, which go out of their way to be unpleasant. You've got the lying figure, the first thing you encounter, that looks like a person wrapped up in a cross between a bin bag and a straitjacket, just bumbling around clumsily. The mannequins are spider-like creatures made from a pair of woman's legs stacked on top of another pair of woman's legs. And the abstract daddies are, those thrusting pistons in the first encounter are certainly symbolic of something. Oh, that's what it's symbolic of. Thanks, Silent Hill Wiki. Where would we be without you? Many have discussed the psychosexual imagery of Silent Hill's monsters, with the creatures of Silent Hill 2 representing James's sexual frustration and the abstract daddy fight representing Angela's sexual abuse. Similar monsters in Silent Hill 3 represent pregnancy due to the cult's efforts to force a demonic embryo into the protagonist, Heather, and I mean, Christ, this boss isn't even hiding the sexual symbolism. This is where Silent Hill uses gruesome imagery well. It adds to the symbolism and the atmosphere, rather than being there purely for shock value. This is gore and body horror done right. But Dead Space is the game that thrives on it. The necromorphs that poor Isaac Clarke goes up against are the very definition of body horror, as they are all human corpses infected with an alien virus, using their flesh and bone to create horrific creatures designed to create and infect even more corpses. They are not pleasant to look at, and the implications of what they are is horrifying. And while Dead Space is action-oriented, the sheer relentlessness of these beasts of unfathomable design is constantly unpleasant. And when you get pregnant ones that birth tiny creatures, or this slender fellow that's actually several squids in a trench coat that like to try and pilot Isaac like a mech, well, that's just terrible. Just to make it clear that this is what their focus is, the sequel opens with this scene of a man getting turned into a necromorph right in front of Isaac's face, and later features a scene where Isaac has to poke himself in the eye in one of the most uncomfortable scenes in gaming. Dead Space does not quit with its devotion to body horror, from the first chapter that reminds Isaac that limb severing is a hugely important game mechanic several times over, right up until he has to fight this thing. But it never feels cheap or excessive, because this is an alien hive mind that uses our flesh as a horrid vessel, and just that simple concept is enough to keep the skin crawling for several hours. Well done, Visceral. Certainly earned that name. The next technique I'm going to discuss might sound like the first technique, but there is a difference. While nothing is scarier is often where an implied threat exists, but nothing is noticeably there, the weird and the eerie is a technique that presents things as normal, but something is just off. Do you want to make people feel immediately uncomfortable? How about London streets, but completely empty? Nothing is threatening about this scene until you realise it's meant to be a lot more populated than this normally. What I'm talking about here is an office building where everyone operates with typical office politics, complaining about Emily drinking the last of the coffee, Simon sending yet another email using reply all, and the executive bathroom being lost in a temporal anomaly, and if it's not rectified, we're reporting it to the authorities. Wait, what was that last one? Well, nothing is scarier derives from fear of the unknown. The weird and the eerie takes the known and twists it. For most of our games, it's not a major technique as the creeping dread tends to overshadow it, but there are certainly elements of it here and there. Dead Space, for instance, doesn't really use this technique. The locations are generally alien, quite literally. It's in space, on a spaceship, in the future. The technology is different and the environments aren't familiar. It doesn't feel off because it's a completely different setting to what we're used to. Amnesia uses it a little more effectively, but the big spooky castle tends to also ramp up the tension more than just make us feel a little off. That said, there are some areas that could make for some nice places to be, like the library, which would be fairly cozy if it wasn't for the encroaching dread and the growling winds. This really starts coming into play with Resident Evil though. Spencer Mansion, upon entry, seems like a pretty nice house. It has an elegant staircase and some gorgeous decor, even more so in the remake. And then we venture into the dining room, which is also pretty sweet, and we could probably have a fine banquet in this place if it wasn't for
Chris's blood
in the corner. But the further you explore the mansion and find hidden compartments that open by playing Midnight Sonata, trap rooms where
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
and doors that only open with gems, or puzzles that force crows to attack you if you get them wrong. The shambling zombies are scary, sure, but the increasingly bizarre architecture of this house raises questions about whose house this is and why they need a gas room full of knight statues. It seems a little sus. Not to mention the director's cut implying a collection of haunted trombones has been walled up somewhere in the basement. Look, I had to bring it up sometime. Fatal Frame 2 evokes similar feelings in a more sinister way. Minakami Village at first seems like a fairly standard traditional Japanese village, if a little dilapidated. Wait, why is there a cell in the basement of this house? Why does the toy maker's house have a bunch of notes about him animating a doll? And why are these blankets placed in a way that implies something underneath them? Is this Audition now? All in all, something is very wrong with this village, even if you don't get to the ghosts or the winding underground passages that lead to hidden ritual chambers covered in blood. But Silent Hill 2 uses the eerie to the best effect. Silent Hill itself is a tourist resort that James associates with nice holidays with his wife, but the town he now visits is fogged over, eerily quiet and full of vast holes. James's journey from place to place often makes little sense geographically, especially as he keeps moving downwards, and locations shift dramatically, especially as we move into like the other world sections. Nowhere is this more effective than in the hotel towards the end of the game. While the entire game features locations that go from spooky yet grounded in reality to hellish landscapes of terror, the hotel's transformation is more subtle and more meaningful. When James arrives, the hotel looks like any other location in the game, abandoned and in a state where it could potentially be revived, but then after the game's big twists, the hotel suddenly falls into an even worse state of disrepair, with the basement level flooded and the wallpaper peeling even further, and burn marks from where it burnt down? I can't be right. It ends up feeling like The Shining, where the hotel was equally as bizarre in its structure as Kubrick went out of his way to make the hotel impossible to map and subconsciously unsettle the viewer. Silent Hill 2 clearly took this on board and ran with it too. But Silent Hill's use of this extends to characters, particularly Maria, who looks exactly like James's dead wife. Moments with her seem normal and straightforward, with the two of you trying to survive and escape the horrors of the town, but her appearance, plus the fact that she just keeps dying, and then weird scenes like this one.
James!
Mary? Oh, Maria. It's you. I thought you were... Sorry. Anyway, I'm glad you're alive.
Anyway!
Make her feel like a supernatural entity in her own right. Something the final encounter straight up admits that she is, but the game keeps the player guessing up to that point. Silent Hill 2's refusal to let the player feel too comfortable, even in quiet moments, is exactly why it's gained the acclaim it has, and a superb use of the weird and the eerie to generate its horror. Horror stories tend to reflect the fears of their time. Slasher flicks of the 70s and 80s following prominent news stories about serial killers, alien invasion movies following our initial exploration into our wider universe, and the madness-driven tales of Poe and Lovecraft following the growth of psychoanalysis with the likes of Freud and Jung. Modern horror examples continue to show this. Black Mirror, a bleak series of cautionary tales about technology, would not exist without the growth of social media and rapid acceleration of technology, where the question of can we is often not accompanied by should we. Get Out explored concerns about subtle racism in America, particularly from those who claim to be supportive. And Midsommar is a twisted look at an increasing lack of community and the dark places that could lead to. Although, not literally dark in that case. Each of our featured games also touch on fears such as these, or draw from classic fears in some way, although some are definitely more direct than others. Dead Space is the most divorced from the real world, but it does speak to a wider existential fear of the wider cosmos and our place within it, something that's expressed in sci-fi horror across the board. Its main inspirations, Alien and Event Horizon, also feature an extraterrestrial threat that is so far outside our earthly understanding, we question if we really want to know what's out there in the void. Because what these guys found was this H.R. Geiger killing machine, this hell portal that's caused Dr. Alan Grant to rip out his eyes, and this alien race that forms out of human corpses. More directly on this planet is Resident Evil's fears, which are not unique to just that game. Zombie media since Romero's Night of the Living Dead has always been about the collapse of society, where the authorities prove useless in the face of a biological threat, and it becomes every man for himself, with critiques of conformity being prominent in the genre. The sequel, Dawn of the Dead, especially skewers consumerism by filling a mall full of zombies, because do you get it? Do you get it? They're all zombies and they're shopping? Do you get it? Resident Evil isn't quite this smart, taking the monsters from Romero's work without necessarily bringing the social commentary with it. And yet some of it still managed to sneak in. The distrust in authority shows up when Wesker, your squad leader, turns out to be in on everything. An anti-corporate message with Umbrella being a corrupt pharmaceutical company with nefarious ends. And there's possibly a slight at the rich, considering who funded the whole sordid operation and who owned the mansion. Of course, it's all likely accidental, as Resident Evil's writing has problems.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Plus, the game is little more than a reskinned and updated version of the game Sweet Home, which is based on the movie of the same name, which was actually more of a standard ghost story rather than a zombie story. But it's interesting that Romero's social commentary still found its way in there all the same. Amnesia's fears mostly stem from the mind, as Daniel desperately tries to piece together what he's doing there. I'll go into this a little more in the next section, because if I state it all here, I'll just end up repeating myself. Silent Hill 2's fears may appear less obvious on the surface, but ultimately it is a story about grief. James Sunderland has lost his wife and returns to their special place, only to find it's all crumbled, shrouded in fog, and full of danger. There's a sense that returning to Silent Hill allowed James to relive his memories of Mary and hold on to her through his grief, but the state of the town reflects the fact that she is, in fact, gone. And the fact that another woman shows up looking exactly like his dead wife, who dies repeatedly in front of him, usually at the hands of a sadistic torturer, just adds to this fear. He doesn't want to face the fact that he is widowed and trudges through the town desperate to fix that which cannot be fixed. And finally, Fatal Frame 2 reflects the fears of its era in the sense that its brand of horror directly reflects what Japanese horror movies were up to at the exact same time. You take the fears surrounding the shifts in Japanese culture following World War II and blend them with traditional folk tales about vengeful ghosts. The result is a whole genre of movies where vengeful spirits, usually those of abused girls, take revenge on anyone who crosses their path regardless of how deserving they are of punishment. Ring looks at the rise of these newfangled videotapes everyone's sharing around. Dark Water draws from fears of crowded communities in apartment buildings. One Missed Call looks at the rise of mobile phones. And so on. Fatal Frame 2 cribs from these movies extensively, especially with at least two ghosts with long stringy black hair crawling from inside something, in one case quite literally a well. But Fatal Frame 2 also touches more directly on traditional beliefs, and raising the question of whether or not the move away from tradition could lead to, a hell portal opening up. For the protagonists, there's an extra layer of fear. The two sisters are close, having grown up together and sharing a bond that twins typically have in this kind of story. They're dependent on each other, which is why the game frequently separates them, forcing Mio to save or find her sister. They both deeply fear losing each other, and at the end of the game, supernatural forces push Mio to strangle Mio, permanently separating them and leaving her alone. There are so many fears crammed into this game, and it's another reason why I love it so much. While fears of external threats are one thing, another way horror messes with our minds is by making us question our own sanity, and the threat of our own minds working against us. As I discussed in the last episode, I know exactly what it means to have your own mind turn on you. Mental illness can sometimes feel like living in a horror movie, and with the amount of horror media that revolves around someone losing their mind, it just heightens that connection. H.P. Lovecraft used this technique extensively. His work is full of entities unknowable to the human psyche or geometry that defies physics and dimensions as we know it, and to observe these things is to drive any man mad. It's all intensely uncomfortable, although these days the discomfort is heightened whenever the author's ferociously racist worldview creeps in. Seriously, the cat's name is Nit. Anyway, this is another technique that's hard to get right, and made worse by the fact that if you get it really wrong, you end up enhancing the stigma of mental illness. You only need to look at this year's Suicide of Rachel Foster to see this, a game that used suicide and mental illness for shock value, and ended up doing little but pissing everyone off, and somehow saying that paedophilia could be acceptable in some circumstances, and just yikes. But if you get this right, and probe deep into the minds of the characters for your horror, and subsequently into the minds of your audience, this can be one of the most effective types of horror out there. Because while a monster can be scary, imagine being unable to escape the monsters inside your own head. Resident Evil doesn't even come close to touching on this. It's a haunted house full of monsters that bite your neck. It's kind of that simple. There is a sinister corporation behind all the horror that could spark some paranoia early on, but it's not really paranoia if they're really out to get you. Fatal Frame 2 has elements of this trope in its narrative, but it's not a central theme. Characters going mad in the face of supernatural terror do show up, with the falling woman from earlier throwing herself from a balcony out of sheer terror, for instance. Mio can glimpse the abyss and an alternate ending which looks back at her, but instead of going mad, she goes blind. However, Mayu is probably the best example of mental anguish within the game. She's intensely devoted to her sister, even calling out for Mio to not go too far if you walk even a couple of steps ahead of her. And she appears to break down when she gets trapped in a cell, allowing ghostly possession to take hold. It's clear that she suffers from a severe kind of separation anxiety and needs to stay close to her sister. And it gets worse with the alternate final boss fight featuring a subtle message from Mayo that suggests she broke her own leg as a child, so she'd become dependent on Mio and force them to stay together forever. And well, there's a lot of unhealthy stuff to unpack there. But with Mayu being possessed for a big chunk of the game by Sae, a failed sacrificial lamb, that adds a layer of mental anguish to her situation. Imagine having no control of your actions as you're compelled to head into danger that will lead to your death. Separation anxiety aside, this is a terrifying thing to imagine happening to yourself. Dead Space is heavy on psychological terror. Outside of the game's extensive use of body horror, the hive mind, stemming from an artifact known as the Marker, also appears to have a psychic effect on those in its vicinity, and Isaac falls victim to it. Towards the end of the game, he finds his girlfriend, Nicole, alive and well. As he aids her in trying to escape from the horrors, he discovers that Nicole has been dead the entire time, and that what he's been seeing has been a hallucination caused by the Marker, influencing him to raise whatever this is. If only he'd been paying attention to the chapter titles, he might have seen this coming. Where this really comes into play is in the sequel though, where Isaac sees Nicole everywhere, despite her being still very dead. A big chunk of this game's plot is about Isaac's increased schizophrenia caused by the Marker, and hallucinations are frequent. So now you have to deal with that, which enhances the horror of the series, and surely it could only go up from here.
Isaac, you made it.
Thank God.
I knew you'd catch up.
Good to see you made it, Isaac. Yeah, maybe we should give you two some time alone, huh?
What the hell does that mean?
It means for someone who's in the past, you're awfully glad to see him.
We need him. This mission needs him.
We need him or you need him?
Hey, you got something to say to me, Captain?
Stop.
Never mind. Amnesia is all about the mind. The title alone indicates this, and it's where the fears really come into play. Like how Fatal Frame 2 raises the horror of Mayu acting outside of her own knowledge, Amnesia has this as its central theme. Daniel wakes up with no memory and a note to himself saying that it was an intentional choice. It raises questions of what he did, but it also makes you imagine a situation where you can't trust your own memories, and possibly your own actions. This is why I didn't talk about this much in the fears section, because that is the central fear here. It's directly tied to the mental anguish theme. Daniel figuring out his own past and being horrified to discover what's hidden away, and realizing he doesn't know himself anymore, is terrifying. Imagine waking up one morning to find yourself facing harsh consequences for actions you don't remember committing. That's what Amnesia is all about. Amnesia also leans into the Call of Cthulhu mechanic of sanity meters. This is a clumsy way of representing mental anguish in a game, but it is very much the same idea as Dead Space, where encountering something so horrifying and incomprehensible, your mind breaks and you become psychotic. And I sympathize with Daniel. I never finished Amnesia. He kept giving me panic attacks. Not quite psychotic hallucinations, but certainly up there in terms of mental anguish. So, well done, I guess. And then there's Silent Hill 2, which is just made out of this theme. This is the game that cemented Silent Hill as a location that punishes people for their dark secrets. Every major character in the game is suffering from some kind of mental anguish. Let's focus on the three key characters here: James, Eddie, and Angela, all of whom appear to be trapped in the town. Eddie is a clear sufferer of some kind of psychosis. He's killed people, and while initially he's repulsed by his own actions and denies any wrongdoing, later on he admits to his crimes, stating that
killing a person ain't no big deal. Just put the gun to their head.
The encounters with him culminate in a battle in a meat locker meant to represent his psyche, his cold, detached attitude, coupled with him being mocked for his weight throughout his life. This is a man who's been ridiculed and tossed aside so often that he snapped and became a killer. It's scary, but it's also tragic. Even more tragic is the much more innocent Angela, who often appears withdrawn and possibly a threat to herself. Our first interaction with her shows her to be quiet and reserved, and quite possibly a little uncomfortable around James. We next see her holding a knife in a room with a large mirror, seemingly contemplating suicide. The encounter with the abstract daddy mentioned earlier is also representative of her mental state, and the most telling clue about what's going on in there. She's traumatized from a childhood of sexual abuse, leading her to distrust men and to find herself physically repulsive, resulting in suicidal thoughts. Just like Eddie, there's tragedy in the horror, and there's also a reminder that this is a kind of horror that's very real, even if the hallucinations caused by the town are not. James himself is going through extreme grief, and the world around him reflects his subconscious, including the suppressed memory that Mary died at his hand. The psychosexual imagery of the enemies reflects both James's sexual frustration at his terminally ill wife rotting away in a hospital bed, and guilt over those feelings because, well, his wife was terminally ill and he did care for her, despite those negative thoughts gnawing at him. James's journey is one of the most affecting in games, as he comes to terms with his grief, faces the physical manifestations of his darkest thoughts, and has to confront the reality of his wife really being gone by killing her doppelganger in the final battle. The endless theorizing over the meanings and symbolism of Silent Hill and how the characters' thoughts and fears are directly manifested in the town's monsters is proof that no horror game has come as close to representing mental anguish quite as effectively as this one. But all of these techniques so far represent horror across all media. They can be employed by movies and books just as effectively as they can by games. But what can be done uniquely by video games to convey horror effectively? Silent Hill 2 is possibly the least effective at using its mechanics to represent its horror. While its story is deeply affecting, full of meaning and symbolism, and a horror story that transcends just being horror, its gameplay is mostly wandering around locations and bonking monsters with pipes. That said, it does make effective use of puzzles to maintain its eeriness throughout the game. Most notably the hospital lockbox puzzle, which requires you to run around the hospital finding codes and keys, only to open the many locks and find a single strand of hair. But as weird as the puzzles are, they're not particularly scary and seem more on a par with the likes of Monkey Island in their weirdness, and That wasn't a scary game, I can assure you. Dead Space fares slightly better. The gameplay of Dead Space is mainly a slow third-person shooter in spooky environments. This does allow the game to throw hordes of gruesome monsters at the player, and as we've established, fighting these off is horrifying enough. And Isaac's slow stomping speed and the fact that chopping off limbs and creating extra gore is central to conserving ammo, the game also does a lot to prevent you from feeling totally helpless. Shops are prevalent, as are credits to spend in them, meaning you're not likely to run out of ammo too much. Enemies drop plenty of resources, and any area where you have to be mindful of air levels or your stasis meter helpfully come with a recharge station in easy reach. I'm not saying that Dead Space is too easy, as it does have plenty of challenge in its runtime, but as a horror game designed to make you feel helpless and struggling to survive, it doesn't do a great job. Resident Evil is where it starts to get better, because this game didn't call itself survival horror for nothing. You can only carry so many items, and if you're walking around with a gun, some ammo, and a healing item just in case, there's not a lot of space left for keys and puzzle items. This results in a lot of running between save rooms so you can arrange your inventory, leave stuff behind where necessary, and figure out your next moves. The limited supplies the game gives you versus the amount of enemies you have to fight off is intentionally unbalanced to make you consider everything you're carrying. This increases the tension, as each trip around the mansion is a mad dash to dodge zombies you've calculated can be dodged easier, making sure you go to specific places with specific items to manage your space, and run back the same routes to return unnecessary items to the box. There's a bit of trial and error, and occasionally it can be exhausting to have to trek back to the save room all the time, but that's the point. It's a system that encourages you to think about your actions and what should be a priority. But Fatal Frame 2 takes this system and refines it, adding in a whole new element to shake things up and enhance the fear. The combat system in Fatal Frame is built around a camera, and taking photos of ghosts damages them. But standard shots do little damage, so you're encouraged to either build up power by staring at the ghost for a long time, or wait for the ghost to attack you head on and snap them at the last minute, prompting the titular Fatal Frame to kick in and do a ton of damage. It's a high risk, high reward mechanic that pushes you to let the ghost get up close and personal with you. Get it right and you inflict a ton of damage, get it wrong and you get grabbed. But adding to this is the film. The more powerful ghosts get, the harder it can be to damage them with the base film, so film types with greater exorcism power are ideal. However, these are rare, and you don't want to burn them out on weaker ghosts and find yourself completely running out of film, stuck with the infinite yet uselessly weakened slow Type 07 film. Like Resident Evil has you balancing your inventory, Fatal Frame pushes you to consider your film types and your lens to each situation, and if you get it wrong, it can screw you over in the long term, which just increases the tension about how to tackle the ghosts you encounter. But Amnesia has the best integration between story and gameplay. While other protagonists exhibit some degree of combat skill, Daniel has no way to fight back. As you descend into the depths of the castle and the threats increase, things get a lot more tense because you can't defend yourself. Every horror you encounter requires you to run and hide, and often your hiding places are limited too. As such, the atmosphere of Amnesia is one where you need to search around for answers to the mysteries at hand, while actively being discouraged by the possibility of something appearing to kill you. It makes later portions of the game immensely stressful, no doubt reflecting the mental stress Daniel is going through in figuring out what's going on. Oh yes, and speaking of mental stress, as I mentioned, there is a sanity meter where looking too long at monsters or spending too long in the dark leads to your vision distorting and the sound design to get louder and more unsettling. It doesn't quite go to the lengths of the excellent sanity meter in Eternal Darkness, where the horror bleeds through the fourth wall and deletes your saves, turns your TV off, resets the game, and does a bunch of other assorted effects that make full use of the video game medium for scares. But Amnesia's more subtle and eerie approach does fit well into Amnesia's general attitude towards horror. Bleed it in through the edges, make the player uncomfortable, and keep them on edge. And it's really good at it. So good that I will never play it again. Sorry, Frictional. And now, here we are at the end of our horror journey, much more educated on the horrors that await us in video games. And now that we've examined all that, what stands out as the best approach? The simple answer is, without me even trying to make it happen, 4 of the 5 games topped my arbitrary ranking for each category, almost evenly at that too. Resident Evil was the exception, as its approach to horror has always been slightly campy and not quite as scary as the competition. However, it does create tension in its gameplay and is very effective at doing so, and other entries in the series have been a lot more effective. as they've learned from this first attempt. Dead Space excels at being a gory blockbuster that sits perfectly alongside its obvious sci-fi horror inspirations. It has the madness of Event Horizon, the vent-crawling relentless killing machines of Alien, and the unsettling body horror of The Thing. The gore is shocking, but the implications of what causes it are horrific and elevate it beyond just a bog-standard ludicrous Gibbs shooter like Doom. It plays up its madness-inducing horror under a layer of high-action violence, and while this is a vastly different approach to the other games, it does work at being scary. Fatal Frame plays on the fear of death, but also the fear of what lies beyond death. Spirits are a universal element of folklore, so even its intensely Japanese framing is relatable around the world. The ghosts bearing the marks of their violent deaths, the eerie quiet, and the fact that getting through this world largely revolves around having the ghosts get all up in your business in first person just heightens the spooks. Silent Hill uses mental health and grief to a great degree to tell a psychologically interesting story with layers and symbolism in a manner so far and beyond a lot of video game storytelling. It terrifies by making you consider what the horrors on screen actually mean, leaving them to linger in your mind for much longer. And Amnesia leaves you confused and helpless in a world full of impending doom. It keeps you on edge even when you're safe. It doesn't let you defend yourself. Your defense against madness opens you up to violence at the hands of horrific creatures that shouldn't exist. And it never ever wants you to breathe and take stock. And all of these games got rave reviews, have armies of beloved fans, and have been incredibly influential on where horror games are now. So it's clear that all of these approaches work well, and that the genre is incredibly diverse, and that there are many, many ways to do horror well. But what we can take away is what they all have in common. The best examples of horror try and make the player feel helpless, try and layer their horrors with subtext that lingers long after you've played, and don't just rely on cheap jump scares to keep the player engaged. Telling a horror story well is a tricky thing to get right, as relying on shock value and gore at the expense of a strong emotional core always falls flat. Good horror makes its audience think as much as it makes them scream. And if you can wrap this into the mechanics of a game, even better. And that is where we will leave this extensive exploration of how games can tell effective horror stories. I hope you've enjoyed the journey and bear these techniques in mind next time you play a horror game. If you've got other examples of effective horror in games, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. And maybe even some examples of where games have handled this stuff badly too. And if you've enjoyed this, I also have a playlist of the rest of the series where I've delved into games such as Celeste, The Last of Us 2 and Portal, while elsewhere I've been running through a Halloween spooktacular, and you can see the links to those at the end of this video, along with the names of the lovely patrons who've helped support this. I also have links in the description of some excellent videos on adjacent subjects from other channels that I feel are worth checking out. And on that note, thank you for joining me this Halloween, and I'll see you again very soon.